All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's adult education session. I am so excited to have with us Zach Courser, who is an integral part to the Claremont community. I was really glad the chance we had over dinner to get to know each other a little bit better. And not only is he really involved in a lot of important issues in this area, but he's just an incredible human being. And so we are so glad to have him. He is currently the leader of the policy lab at CMC, Claremont McKenna, and also teaches there as a professor of government. And before his time here in Claremont, he has worked at Capitol Hill. He's been a professor in France, is that right? Yeah. And has worked on a number of very important policy issues. He was telling me a little bit about his work, looking at voter access right now. And he has also done a lot on issues surrounding homelessness, which we know affordable housing, issues of homelessness is a very hot topic in Claremont and one that requires our advocacy and knowledge. And so it's important to be informed. And so that is one reason among many why we are honored to have Zach with us here today. So the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that warm introduction and for the invitation. And I'll try to make this sometimes dry subject as exciting as I can, because homelessness, of course, is a crisis in Los Angeles County. It's all over the country, really, but it's really acute here. And I think we all know many of the causes of this, but we don't really know, I think, the details of how government responds and how the funding comes together and what the policies are that underlie making decisions about land use, making decisions about homelessness and homelessness services. And so we sometimes don't know where we can put our time in terms of being effective advocates, but also where we can put our time in terms of giving feedback to our governments and hopefully coming up with a better system that better understands the causes of homelessness and better responds to the needs of housing and the needs of those who are unhoused. So today's talk, I mean, there can be a bewildering variety of agencies involved in homelessness. You know, I'm going to talk for about 25, 30 minutes or so and then leave time for questions. You know, don't expect that I'm going to be able to explain everything here. I'm just going to try to do my best to give you an overview and then try to give you some insights into what some of the problems are, why it is that the problems persist despite all of the resources that are going to this problem here locally and in California and in the nation as a whole. So you can see here just on my first page, this is just a sampling of all the different governmental or agencies or interest groups that are involved here locally in the homelessness problem. And you can see there's quite a variety, and this is just only some of them. Here. So I guess a place to start is at the top. In the 1980s, Congress became aware that, you know, not only was homelessness and housing continuing national problems, but there was a lack of coordination and understanding about how different parts of government could come together and deal with the disparate causes of homelessness. You know, homelessness doesn't have one cause, it has many. The most acute, of course, is lack of housing. And so the Congress sort of was wondering, you know, how do we bring together nonprofits, local governments, state governments, and the federal government together to coordinate on this issue. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development became tasked with supervising these continuums of care, is what they're called, COCs. And this is a term that you'll come across if you get into housing policy and homelessness policy. People will be looking first to what are called these continuums of care to sort of understand, first off, the magnitude and scale of the problem, a measurement of the problem, and then a coordination of services between, you know, all sorts of different players who relate to housing and homelessness. So the federal government, you know, you apply to become a continuum of care. It tends to be, I'll talk about the sort of local dimensions of our continuum of care. But essentially these continuums, and, you know, I won't read this whole thing, but they're trying to coordinate homelessness services and make an impact on homelessness. So what do they actually do? Well, the program components are working on building permanent housing, transitional housing, supportive services, trying to create management systems and prevent homelessness. And then there are only certain kinds of eligible costs that the federal government will reimburse. Those have to do with the acquisition or rehabilitation of property for housing, new construction, leasing costs, rental assistance, supportive services, operating costs, data management costs, and administrative costs. So it's really focused on building housing, and it's really focused on measuring and trying to bring commensurate resources towards the problem. In Los Angeles, we have the Los Angeles Homelessness Services Authority, or LAHSA as it's deemed, and it is the continuum of care for Los Angeles County and all cities contained in Los Angeles County, except Glendale, Long Beach, and Pasadena. They have created their own continuums of care. It is an option for cities to basically come up with their own continuum plans and take on that responsibility in their communities if they so wish. And these three cities have, you may have noticed during the pandemic that Long Beach and Pasadena also have their own health departments. Being larger cities within the county, they tend to opt out on these sorts of things, and they have on this as well. But for Los Angeles as a whole, LAHSA is primarily responsible for the measurement and for bringing services to bear on the homelessness problem. You may also be aware of Measure H. 2017 seems like a long time ago already, but it wasn't that long ago. Measure H was part of a package that the city and county of Los Angeles were working together. There's been a lot of disagreement, and I think there's others who have a lot more experience with this difficulty than I do, but there has been since the 1980s and maybe even before a sort of continual passing of the buck between the city and county of Los Angeles about who was primarily responsible for housing and homelessness and the homelessness crisis. This is nothing new. So in the early 1990s, LAHSA was created, and into the aughts and more recently up to 2017, when Measure H was passed, there was a deal that was sort of struck between the city and the county, where the city passed something called Measure HHH, which was focused on building housing within the city of Los Angeles. And the county put up Measure H, which was largely focused on services, not necessarily building housing, but services. And I'll talk more about why it is that the county focuses on services. It really has much to do with their remit in terms of being a county government and the fact that cities are responsible primarily for land use. But Measure H, was a response to the growing homelessness crisis in our area. It added a quarter cent to sales tax in Los Angeles for 10 years, starting in March of 2017. It was projected to generate over $3.5 billion over 10 years. In fact, the most recent budget that's been proposed for Measure H is over $500 million. When you think of the scale of the problem and the size of Los Angeles County, 10 million residents, is that enough? It certainly sounds like a lot. And I think there's a lot of questions being asked about, how these funds are being used, how effective the county has been in using Measure H, how effective it has been overall in dealing with homelessness and mitigating the crisis. And time will be up fairly soon where Measure H will expire, and there'll probably be a new campaign, a new discussion about where Los Angeles County goes from here. So it's an important critical part of the overall response locally to homelessness. But the question is, how does Measure H actually work? What does it do? I mean, it's a lot of money. We know that it's run by the county, but if you're here locally in the city of Claremont, how does Measure H affect you? Well, I'm not going to read all of these things to you, but this is basically the plan for Measure H. A number of strategies, in coordination with the county, nonprofits like United Way, stakeholders throughout the county, a strategy was put together, a fairly wide-ranging strategy under these different headings and subheadings. And this is primarily what Measure H pays for. But what is sort of curious about this is how little it has to do with building housing. It's really about services. It's about encouraging, for instance, subsidized housing. It's about increasing affordability where possible, but it's not really a program to build housing. And this has been something of a frustration for a lot of communities who want more material support for building housing and finding the availability of funds for building housing. A feeling that cities were not fully integrated into this plan, that it was something of a top-down county approach rather than one that focused on more local solutions to homelessness and housing. Skip forward here. Really, the role of cities in terms of the county's understanding were these primary strategies. One, that cities would contribute funding towards the cost of rapid rehousing for their homeless students. So it's really more about spending money than cities getting money. Dedicating federal housing subsidies to permanent supportive housing for chronically homeless individuals. Ensuring that law enforcement and other first responders effectively engage homeless families and individuals. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, using land use policy to maximize the availability of homeless and affordable housing. Because this is really the disconnect in many ways. And I'll talk more about the disconnect in terms of cities, but the disconnect here is counties don't set land use policy, cities do. And yet the county in this case with Measure H has all the money, but they don't really have the keys to the kingdom, which is deciding what to build, where to build, and what to build. That's really the responsibility of cities. And there's been this disconnect between Measure H, in my view, and the part of combating homelessness that's about building housing. There's been a kind of disconnect and disagreement between many cities and the county about how to put those resources together. Now, the county side of this, I think, is that cities are really reluctant to build housing, at least the kind of housing they believe is needed. Cities complain that the county is not supporting them financially in dealing with the homelessness crisis. But there's really not this bridge between, okay, we'll provide services, you provide the housing. That's really never developed like it should have. And so, these funds, this $500 million, they're sort of indirectly going to building housing, but they're really more about county services than they are about housing. Just to give you an idea of the funding and how the funding works here, like if we're sitting here in Claremont as a city and wondering, well, how do services and funds filter down to our level of government? And the answer is that they don't really directly. Because again, cities, at least our city, who's a part of the Los Angeles Continuum of Care, essentially, our city is represented by that continuum of care. We participate in the services that are offered countywide, but we don't really offer them at the city level. We're part of that continuum, but we're not sort of directly administering that continuum. We're a client of that continuum, if you will. And so if we look at local funding for Measure H, there's really not a lot that's come directly to the city. There's been certain grants that have been given to the city, for instance, to come up with its own homelessness strategy, monies to plan, pay for consultants, things of that nature. But by and large, cities have to go through either their Council of Governments or they have to go through the United Way and make grant requests to actually obtain dollars to expand services that relate to housing and homelessness. So the San Gabriel Valley's Council of Governments has received some grants from Measure H and have made them available through grants to cities, and Claremont has applied for some of this funding. The United Way has also offered a number of grants. But it's not terribly easy for, say, local community groups to get this kind of funding. United Way is probably the way that is easiest, but if you want to get it directly from the Continuum of Care, from LAHSA, you have to be an approved vendor. basically you have to, meet certain requirements, and it narrows the ability of local groups to participate and benefit from a lot of this funding. It tends to go to a lot of organizations that have been around for a very long time. And in my opinion, I think it tends to limit innovation, and I think it does tend to cause these monies and these kinds of solutions to kind of run backwards in terms of how this problem was dealt with in the past, rather than thinking about how we can work on it in the future, be more innovative and dynamic in the ways in which we think about housing and homelessness. But there's, the monies, the state in fiscal year 22 is going to make about $84 million available to LAHSA. In terms of state funding, most of the state funding tends to get gobbled up by the 13th largest cities in California. If you're a medium to small size city, you tend not to get this money. It tends to be prioritized for larger cities, particularly Los Angeles. There's been some push and pull and some limits that have been placed on how much can go to LA County or Los Angeles, because they have the highest need as measured by these continuums of care in terms of visible homelessness, the number of persons who are measured as being homeless. And there's been some attempts to try to preserve more money for other cities and regions of the state, but by and large, most of that money does go to large cities in California, not to medium and small cities. The Department of Housing and Urban Development just approved $155 million for LAHSA, for our continuum of care. Again, largely based on the size of the problem and the size of the county. That's why that number is fairly large. And then I already mentioned there's about $500 million being proposed to be spent just this coming year, fiscal year 22, I guess we're in it now, on housing and homelessness. So I was just saying that, one of the things that continuums of care do is to measure homelessness. And the primary means of measuring homelessness is to measure visible homelessness. And I think there's some problems with this. First off, these are the numbers for the city of Claremont. You can see there's a point in time count. You may have been asked to volunteer for this at times, or read about it in the newspaper. Essentially, volunteers go out and look at the community and basically try to measure from a distance people that they think are likely unsheltered and unhoused. And this count is really the measure of the scale of homelessness. And for Claremont's count, now we've had to cancel these counts a number of times due to COVID, so these numbers are not really current, but as of 2020, the count only showed about 17 people in Claremont that were unhoused. And then this also shows statistics from the coordinated entry system, which is the LAHSA system for basically the front door to services for people who are unhoused, deciding what their needs are, doing an assessment, and trying to get them those services or that housing. So I think this is somewhat faulty because a lot of what we see in homelessness is not necessarily visible. There are a lot of people who, for instance, are insecure in terms of their housing. That is to say, they're living with relatives, they're living in crowded conditions that are very suboptimal. Sometimes they're living in their vehicles. Sometimes they're otherwise housing insecure. They're on a temporary housing setup that is tenuous and could end at any moment. And so it's a very imperfect way of trying to measure homelessness. There's homelessness or housing needs that are not being measured and therefore are not being met through this count, because what we measure is what we do. And so I would say, for Claremont, the 17 is misleading. There are, for instance, in the Claremont Unified School District, many students, who are either, homeless, living in vehicles, or living with family members, or otherwise housing insecure. That's just not picked up in this. Let me switch from talking about thinking about how we measure and deal with homelessness in terms of services and talk more directly about housing. And the linkage is very clear here in Los Angeles County and in California, that housing prices have been rising unabated, and there's been really no commensurate building of supply to meet that demand. And it's very, without taking out my supply and demand charts and playing economist, I think you can pretty much see if housing prices have risen about 300% since the year 2000, there's a problem here with the supply of housing and the cost of housing. And it's particularly acute here in Los Angeles County. So what are the problems? Why are we not sort of meeting the challenge that's being put before us when it comes to housing? And and I think we can stipulate at this point that one of the major drivers of homelessness is lack of housing. This is the way that the state thinks about it, and this is the way in which we're trying to, one of the major ways we're trying to make inroads on the homelessness problem is on housing supply. How can we increase either permanent housing, permanent supportive housing, or temporary housing to help people get off the street and into a home, and hopefully back into jobs as well. Well, I think it may have something to do with not just a policy failure, but a government failure, and the ways in which we in California and really in all states approach decisions about land use. Cities have primary responsibility for land use decision. They are the ones who decide, again, what gets built, where it gets built, how it gets built. There's a lot of input that cities get in deciding what is built in their communities, and you can understand why. Local control, is a virtue in many ways in terms of having citizen input and having these structures and questions being dealt with at an extremely local level, so people get input and understanding about what's happening in their community and have some control over it. This is largely done in California through city councils and planning commissions. They're sort of the primary deciders on these kinds of questions. State governments do not directly make local land use decisions, but they do have responsibility for housing policy, and there lies a disconnect. The state has the resources. The state, of course, is superior legally to cities in terms of its ability to pass laws. Cities largely are creatures of state government. There's some exceptions to that if you're a charter city, and basically you can get more autonomy from the state. Many California cities are charter cities, and so they don't have as much oversight, and they have more direct power. But ultimately, the state is responsible. The state sets the laws, and they have lots of goals for housing policy that are not being met because they're relying on cities to build that housing. But there's a disconnect there between the state's ability to either encourage or force cities to build housing. And that's kind of the crisis that we're in now as a policy dimension, is this continuing sort of lack of building, this sort of recalcitrance that many cities have towards building housing projects, and the state's continual pushing back and trying to encourage or force cities to build housing. It's clear California cities aren't approving enough housing development. When we look at prices, when we look at homelessness, when we look at all the different sort of signals and signs, it's very clear California cities aren't living up to their obligations. There's ways in which the state tries to help cities to plan and measure what the actual housing needs are. A regional housing needs assessment. You may have heard about this. Maybe you've read it in the paper. Maybe you've heard about Claremont's. It's a long, community-driven process where the state, through a formula, basically says, cities need to build this kind of housing for these kinds of income levels in this time frame. There's really nothing in those plans, though, that can force cities to actually carry it out. There's ways that the state can make things uncomfortable for the city. I think there's more pressure being brought to bear, and I'll talk about that in a second, in terms of motivating cities. You might remember a few years back that Governor Newsom sued a number of cities who were not being compliant with their regional needs housing assessment plans. But again, there's still that disconnect between the state need to promote housing policy, in this case, building more housing, and relying on cities who are ultimately the deciders about what gets built. Another problem to this, and I don't think this gets talked about very often or enough, is that since the 1940s, California had what were called redevelopment agencies. These were initially put together in the 40s to deal with what at the time was called urban blight. But essentially it was a rebuilding of cities, trying to remove dilapidated or underused parts of the city and giving cities resources to actually develop new housing, for example. Courier Place, which you might be familiar with as an affordable housing development, which is near the train station here in Claremont, was paid for through redevelopment funds some years ago. Unfortunately, under Governor Brown, these funds were eliminated. It was considered too big a drain on the state budget. Basically, it was giving too large a share of the state budget to cities, and many felt that it was very inefficient what was being done with these funds. And so redevelopment agencies are over, and it's really created this gap for cities in terms of how, if they actually want, in the rare instances where they actually want to build affordable housing, the funding mechanism isn't there anymore. There used to, because these things can get quite expensive, of course, in the millions of dollars to build enough to make an impact on the problem. And cities don't have that source of funding, that ready source of funding that they used to have to bring to bear on this problem. There are things that the legislature is doing to try to create more opportunities for cities to get funding. I could talk about those if you're interested, but it really isn't at the scale of the redevelopment agencies. And so this is a kind of missing link in this problem. So what's the state doing about cities dragging their feet about building housing? Well, they're starting to narrow cities' abilities to stop or slow housing development. Land use is becoming less of an exclusive right and power of local government, and is increasingly becoming what's the word, altered by state government and state mandates. For instance, additional dwelling units, or granny flats, as they're sometimes called, used to be, they could be fairly circumscribed by cities. Like cities could add a lot of different kinds of limitations to how you could build an ADU with the size, all sorts of things. And the state basically said, no, cities, you can't do that anymore. Basically, if someone who wants to build an ADU follows these rules, the city no longer has a judgment about whether or not you can build it. It becomes what's called a ministerial process. Basically, you comply with the law, you get to build it. And a lot of the changes that cities would want can no longer be made. Now, some may dislike that and decry it and say, well, this is unfair. Why is it that cities can't decide for themselves what to do about this? And the state would basically respond by saying, cities have not been living up to their responsibility. There's too much of a bottleneck in building more available housing. Therefore, sorry, cities, you no longer have this discretion. That power is taken away. This has also happened by expanding what are called by right developments. If you meet certain criteria for building public housing, or not public housing, but I should say affordable housing, that's done by a nonprofit developer. If you meet certain criteria, basically cities, again, their role becomes ministerial. They can't stop it. They can have input. They can be a part of the process, but they're no longer the deciders about whether or not this gets built. And you may have heard, eliminating single-family zoning has been another means that California has taken to try to change the ways in which cities can stop or slow down housing development. This is something that started in Minnesota and is expanding throughout the country. California has passed a kind of very circumscribed law that has a kind of slow rollout, and I don't think it has the kind of radical effect that some of its opponents are talking about. Essentially, it's saying that you can build a duplex where you used to build a single family home. So the changes aren't terribly radical, and it's also limited in certain ways through compromise in the legislature. But nonetheless, the state is moving, I think, convincingly towards trying to loosen up this bottleneck. And they're doing so by limiting cities' sort of monopoly power on land use. So why is it that cities are so stubborn about this? I mean, are they just bad people? Is it people who don't understand the problem? Why does it cities seem to be bad actors on this? Why aren't they cooperating? Why isn't housing getting built? And I just recommend this book to you if you're interested in this problem. It's not necessarily like the dispositive study of this phenomenon, but I think it's a very good one, and it shows that the problem I'm about to describe is one that exists throughout the country, not just in California. And that is, economic incentives are misaligned in housing policy. What do I mean by that? Well, most cities consist of single-family homeowners. And I haven't taken a lot of time to talk about sort of the history of zoning or talking about redevelopment agencies. A lot of housing policy had its origins in trying to segregate communities in the ways in which communities were designed, and in the ways in which what could be built and in what part of the town. A lot of this had to do with, you've heard terms like redlining before. Minorities could only live in certain communities, in certain areas of town. Redevelopment funds were put towards tearing down minority communities and building others. There's a history of racial segregation that is in zoning. And so one of the ways in which zoning has been used is to try to maximize single-family homes and low-density development, particularly in California. We all know about California sprawl. That sprawl was driven by a decision to have single-family homes, to have low density. There's been a lot of problems associated with that we all live with every day, like traffic. But there's other problems related to it too. If you don't have a very dense environment, you're going to have very expensive housing. If you can't build out anymore, you've got to build up in some sense. But as things stand, most cities consist of single-family homeowners. City councils respond to this constituency. These are the people that elect them. They're primarily the ones who are directing the city. Homeowners have an incentive, an economic incentive, to keep development low and prices high. You want the value of your home to go up. It is your primary investment for most people. It's your primary investment. You don't want to do things that are going to, say, lower the cost of housing, maybe lower the cost of your house, maybe increase traffic, maybe do things that you feel would lower the quality of life or the amenities available to you in your community. And so there's an incentive here to keep development low and prices high. And it's also, because of this, much easier for organization to form to oppose housing than to build it. There's really nobody on the other side of this equation besides, say, the state government and housing advocates, of which there are more, increasingly more in the state. But the sort of logic of economic incentives drives people to oppose housing and to organize in opposition to housing, rather than to organize in favor of housing. The voices that get heard at the city council are always the ones that are against housing. It's rare that you hear people that are for it. It's just that the incentives aren't there to organize. The economic incentives aren't. They're political incentives, moral incentives, perhaps, but it's not quite as easy as people who live on the other side of this equation, so to speak. So this is a quote that I think kind of summarizes the political and policy dimension here. These authors refer to people who oppose housing as neighborhood defenders. And they write, neighborhood defenders are advantaged members of their community via their racial background and homeowner status. They use this advantage, their incumbency in their neighborhoods, to exclude other prospective residents. As current residents, they are able to support candidates in local elections and endorse policies in local meetings that maintain their advantage over newcomers. So there's this hometown advantage as well in the political system to maintaining the status quo and not going for development. And this, again, it's not just in California, it's all over the country. There are local housing and homelessness organizations here that try to fill out the other side of that equation, to try to advocate for more housing. Here locally, Housing Claremont, which I'm a board member of, advocates for local housing and educates the community about housing-related issues. Housing Claremont tries to develop the other side of that equation and try to voice the pro-housing side. You've heard of, sort of YIMBY organizations, Yes in My Backyard, which is a play on No in My Backyard, the NIMBYs. More of these kinds of organizations are forming. The Claremont Unified School District receives monies and does measure and try to address needs for homeless students or students who are in need of housing. So they play a role in this scheme. Aging Next is a senior organization that tries to do a census of at-risk seniors to identify needs and prevent eviction for seniors. The Claremont Homeless Advocacy Program has been, due to COVID and other factors, has not been operating for some time, and it's on pause right now. But they were an organization that was very involved in identifying people and helping them get more stable housing and then back into jobs. And I'm going to stop here by saying, I think there's also increasingly a place for faith-based communities to play a role in this. And I think your church is one that could, is playing and can continue to play a role. I think the state has identified churches, particularly excess land that churches own, as potential for by right development for housing, but also just being the other side of that equation, advocating for those who can't advocate for themselves, speaking outside of economic incentives and speaking instead, from the point of view of the needs of the community. I think there is a role to play there for churches, and I hope that you all will continue to play that role as we move forward, because there are not many of us now speaking in favor of housing development, but I feel the voice is growing. Because if it doesn't start here locally, what I think is going to happen is land use decisions will continue to be narrowed by the state. People will get housing and developments that they don't really have a say in, or as much of a say in. I don't think that in the end that the need will be served quite as efficiently, which the need being to build housing. So I hope you found that interesting and informative. I've got about 5 minutes for questions. Sorry if I talked a bit too long. Yeah.
So I'm not in Claremont or LA County. I'm in the next county over in Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
And the city government is of the party that is not the majority in this state. And they're basically going to take private land, farmland and whatnot, and build more warehouses. That's the mascot of Ontario, is warehouses.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering, is Habitat for Humanity one of these agencies that's acceptable?
I believe they're an approved vendor for Los Angeles County for LAHSA.
I know they had done some building here years ago on the edge of Claremont.
Right. Every bit helps and every organization helps. But again, it really comes down to cities approving those developments. Habitat for Humanity can't really build anything until it's approved.
And I know that number of 17 people is ridiculous. We've had at least 8 stop by the church when we have the free food and clothes and donations and things. And the thing is, how do you count people that way? These people move around. If they have a car, they can move from place to place depending on where it's okay to park. The ones that don't have a car, one guy, he said his name was Rainbow, had just walked 5 miles from Pomona. He went from station to station. He knew the places that you could get free food or clothing or this or that. They move around, and then it's profiling too. You have college students that are homeless. They don't look any different. One of the guys that stopped by, I just thought he was a local jogger. I was used to seeing him in the neighborhood around the church, wearing shorts, out running. No, he was homeless because he came for the food.
Mm-hmm.
You can't tell by what they look like. And it's all ages and all types of people, and they move around.
One of the misperceptions that many people have is that people come here purposely to California, to Los Angeles, to a particular city, that these are outsiders. But part of the count is where people are from. And what you find is the vast majority, over 90%, in some cases 95%, are from the state at the very least, or from the city or the county. So the idea that people are migrating towards California to take advantage in some sense of homeless services is just not correct. Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment on Larkin Place.
In what regard?
Well, there is a kind of an uproar from the residents who live around it. And you saw in the Courier, but I mean, maybe a lot of us went to the meeting. Everybody that showed up was against it, except for, people from Pilgrim Place and, our CEO. And so if the law is allowing Jamboree to build Martin Place and the neighbors are against it, how does it reconcile?
I mean, I guess that is a big question. I mean, I was not able to attend that meeting, but I did talk to friends who did go, and I know many were very disappointed about the tenor of that conversation, if you could call it a conversation. There was a lot of yelling, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of accusation. I think there was a lot of misinformation. And I think a lot of it was coming from a place where people didn't know very much about this plan, didn't know very much about the development. And in that absence, a lot of things sort of filled in that weren't exactly correct. And I think, the success of Larkin Place will be about people understanding what is being built there before they react to it. I think there are well-meaning people who just want to know and are concerned about what's going to be built there. I think there are some bad actors, and I think we see bad actors locally in opposition to development. You've heard the term NIMBY. One of my new favorite terms is bananas. Have you heard this term? Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. I think there's that sentiment out there as well. And I think people will grasp at fear and innuendo and play on people's emotions to make sure that nothing gets built, not even supportive housing, not even something that maybe has a social benefit to the community beyond simply being affordable housing, but any housing. I mean, you look at the opposition to La Puerta in the north part of the city, where the idea was to build $1 million homes, and yet it was just a bridge too far for people who lived in that neighborhood. They wanted to maintain this empty field indefinitely, even though the school district needs the funds needs to sell that land, and they need the funds in order to pay for lots of needs, the educational needs that they have for their district. But yet people put out this idea that, keep La Puerta public, which is both true and misleading. It is public in the sense that it's owned by the school district, but it's not owned by the city. It's not to be dispensed with basically, as a park, let's say. It's a resource that's owned by the district. But I saw a lot of, I think, bad faith arguments being made simply to make sure that nothing gets built anywhere. So how is that a response to your question? I'd say it's, there's a mix of motivations, there's a mix of tactics, but I think the best thing is a sort of coordinated discussion that's about the facts of what's being built or proposed, not on fear and misinformation, trying to create enough fear about these kinds of projects that people will just simply react against them without even listening to what's being done.
Jamboree's going to hold more meetings.
Part of the reason why there hasn't been as much information is, it has to do with funding for this project. Like, it's gone forward much more quickly than people anticipated. The funding has fallen into place much more quickly than people thought, which is great in the sense that, it helps to secure the building. But in terms of a plan, a campaign, it's truncated that sort of like phase of community talk and letting people know what's happening and these sorts of things. And so, like old trains, when they get started, the cars would like bump into each other as the engine started coming out of the station. The cars are bumping right now. But I think hopefully once we get up to speed, it'll be a smoother process. It won't be, from what I heard, I don't think it'll be a completely smooth process. I think there's going to be a lot of opposition. And I don't know how ready that opposition is to listen, but I hope they are.
So the state has a $27 billion surplus, right? Depending on, give or take. From a policy, and there's a lot of pressure on politicians about what are you doing with this homeless crisis. in the state of California. Where do you see in terms of in the horizon relative to policy and investments that the state will make to address affordable housing?
Well, the state has just made $5 billion available for housing and homelessness services. You know, sounds like a big number. Most of it, again, is going to go to the 13 largest cities in the state. You know, for as blue as California is as a state, it is probably one of the most, if not the most, unequal state in the union. You see tremendous wealth side by side with tremendous poverty. And when I say that, you know, cities react to single family homeowners, it doesn't stop there. The governor, who elects the governor? Single family homeowners. Who elects the legislature? Single family homeowners. What are people's biggest assets in California? Their homes. It's a devilish problem, not just for cities, but for the state government as well, to figure out how is it that they can make the state more equal, how they can advance a housing policy to build more housing, and yet not have residents react to it who want to keep things the way they are. They, you know, the incentive tends to be, let's make California a country club. $1 million homes, beautiful parks, low density. It's just not a sustainable vision for the state. And until, you know, homelessness is probably the most visible and worrying sign of this problem. But it's sort of like, you know, where does it end? Does it end? When do we as voters take this to heart and change our minds about our approaches and thinking to development and to housing? Because until we do, there's very little that our elected leaders will do because they're responding to what we want. And right now, what we seem to want is more of the same. Yeah, I know you guys have got to get going here.
I think it will get worse. We haven't fixed the mental health crisis that we created with the Claremont Act, where we just opened all the mental institutions and dumped them on the street. Families were not necessarily there to take them back. We've got veterans with PTSD that might be homeless, people that lost their homes during that last recession, people that lost their homes probably due to COVID unemployment. And there's a climate crisis. We're going to have more surges of immigration from countries that can't deal with that have super hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, you name it. People, rich people that lost their homes from fires in California. It's going to get worse.
I unfortunately have no doubt that it'll get a lot worse before it gets better. And it's, yeah, it's very worrying. I mean, I'm just, as you're talking, I'm sort of thinking to myself about, you know, where we go from here in terms of how
engage the veterans groups, engage the churches.
I mean, it just be absolutely. I wish more people would get caught trying to do something about this, because it seems to be the unspoken rule is do a lot of things, but not too much. There's a lot of activity, there's a lot of money being spent, but don't cross that line of actually doing something that will have an impact, like building housing.
And there's a lot of stereotyping of what a homeless person is.
There's so much more I could have talked about.
People are so afraid. They think of this mentally ill criminal person covered with fleas.
So there may be some questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was just noticing that, but I think I've got to close down here soon. Got a couple more minutes? Okay. So Shirley asks, are there model cities that have created housing and maintain the quality of life that people fear will suffer? There are cities that are doing more than others in terms of trying to increase the supply of housing. But I'll say this, you know, progressivism or politics has so little to do with the effectiveness of cities at meeting this crisis. What do I mean by that? Well, you can look at San Francisco, you know, supposedly the most progressive place in California. You know, they have there's this pitched battle between the Board of Supervisors and the mayor right now about building affordable housing, and 2 affordable housing projects have been struck down by the Board of Supervisors. You know, San Francisco has a really bad reputation when it comes to housing. It dates back to really the 1980s, where there was a movement to de-zone or lower the zoning that basically said you would keep San Francisco as it is. You wouldn't add any more density. You keep things as it were. And it's had the predicted effect, which is, of course, to keep housing prices very high. Sometimes this is done for historic preservation reasons. Oftentimes there's sort of vague community preservation kinds of questions, all of which are important and have a role and a voice that needs to be spoken, but seem to dominate the conversation. So, I don't know that there is a model city, but I know that every city is affected by this, this misalignment of incentives. From Sandy, it seems like in Poland, they have been able to house all the refugees from Ukraine. How come it seems so hard to house unhoused people? Well, I think the reason is there's a lot of empathy and understanding amongst the Poles for what the Ukrainians are going through. They lived behind the Iron Curtain. They feel extremely threatened by Putin. They see themselves in the plight of the Ukrainians. And I think it's as simple as that. We don't see ourselves in this crisis. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. Thanks so much for your attention. Thanks for the invitation.